Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, PR in a Polarized, Politicized World. My name is Michael Gordon. I'm a principal at Group Gordon in New York, and we're very lucky to have Paul Holmes with us today. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the topic and about our firm, introduce Paul, who's going to talk for a couple minutes. Then we're going to do some Q&A, and we'd like you to participate in the Q&A as well. So we appreciate your participating. So first, one of the things I love about our business is that new challenges come to us frequently. Every couple of years, there's something changing that dramatically changes our business. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is how politics has infiltrated all aspects of our lives, and in particular, businesses who used to be under the radar very easily now are finding themselves in the middle of political fray, and it's affecting their businesses. It's also affecting their culture and their employees, and it's affecting how they conduct business. So we thought we'd open that up and talk about that today. Just a little bit about Group Gordon. So we are a higher end communications firm. We like to think of ourselves that way, and that we take the time up front to understand why we're getting engaged, so that we're very disciplined and precise and targeted in our communications. Our written work product is very high, and we're very aggressive in terms of media relations, but aggressive in the right directions and in targeted ways. And our practice is very diverse. A lot of professional services companies, law firms, a wide range of consulting firms, financial technology, a lot of nonprofits in education and other spheres, and we do our share of crises too. So we're very lucky to have Paul Holmes with us today. I've been following Paul for roughly 20 years, I want to say. He is, in my view, the premier thought leader in our industry, and the founder of the Holmes Group, which is sort of the premier organization that leads our industry. And we were lucky to have him join us today. And Paul, any sort of opening thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, at the risk of being an impolite guest, I'm going to push back a little bit on the novelty of this issue, because I think that there's been an intersection of the corporate world and the political world for almost as long as I've been doing this. One of the advantages or perhaps disadvantages of having a 30-year history writing about and thinking about PR is that everything old becomes new again sooner or later. When I arrived in the United States in 1987, and I think it was about 3 years later in 1990, I wrote a story about Dayton Hudson embroiled in a controversy over its donations to Planned Parenthood. That became a huge political debate. Dayton Hudson handled it, despite being pretty smart about public relations in those days. I think quite badly. They first of all withdrew their funding when it became a controversy. Then when the withdrawal became a controversy, they reinstated their funding, and they just went back and forth over the course of about a 6-month period, apparently clueless about what their own position should be, and therefore being buffeted by the tides of public opinion and the loudest voices in the room. And then a couple of years later, we had a similar incident with Levi Strauss cutting off its funding for the Boy Scouts after the Boy Scouts decided that they wouldn't allow gays or atheists. And the contrast there was really quite stark, because Levi Strauss clearly knew what its own position was, what its own values were. And that was one of the first lessons on this for me, is that you have to go into these political debates with a thorough understanding of who you are and what you stand for. And then the second sort of historical lesson that I learned was, I think it was around 2000. The fashion brand Benetton ran a series of ads about prisoners on death row, and was accused of glorifying killers, essentially. Benetton took a very firm stand and said, this is an important issue that we want to bring to the forefront. Sears, which carried Benetton, decided that it would discontinue the brand. And I remember getting a call from somebody, I think at CNBC, asking me which company had done the right thing, and telling them that both had. Benetton was true to its brand, which involved courting controversy and taking a position. Sears was true to its brand, which was essentially avoiding politics and controversy at all costs. And that was really the second lesson I drew about this. Again, it's a variation on the first, but there's no right or wrong as much as there is a determination to stand for what you stand for. I think the thing that has changed, however, is that on a lot of the issues we're seeing today, neutrality is not an option. Levi's and Benetton got into the controversy they did rather deliberately by taking the actions that they did to provoke a reaction. Today, there's no neutral ground on a lot of these issues. If you're not for change, you're for the status quo. And that's making life difficult for a lot of companies that don't perhaps have the comfort level that a Benetton or a Levi's does. The good news, and I'll stop with this thought, the good news is that consumers apparently are willing to reward companies that do know what they stand for and are willing to take a stand. We just held our Provoke 18 conference in Washington, D.C., and Harris Poll was one of the presenters. And one of the interesting things about their sort of most admired reputation quotient rankings is that Chick-fil-A, which is probably the company most sort of associated with right-wing politics in America, certainly with evangelical issues in America, and Patagonia, which has taken a very sort of visible stand on environmental issues, and is actually now endorsing candidates based on environmental issues, are both in the top 10 sort of most admired companies by consumers. Suggests to me that these days consumers like, and of course we've just seen Nike take a very visible political position on Black Lives Matter and Colin Kaepernick, and get rewarded for that. Companies that do have the courage of their convictions have the opportunity to really benefit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we're also seeing companies being brought into the fray against their own will, if you will. And so they need to be more prepared for that and also be ready to act nimble. So let me ask a question. Do you see the evolution of this issue? Do you see it as a no-win situation for brands?
Oh, not at all. I just think suddenly you have to actually live the values that you espouse in a way that may end up making you uncomfortable, but ultimately has the potential to cement and strengthen your relationship with employees, consumers, communities in important ways. I think, those companies that have gotten out in front of these issues and made it really clear what they stand for. If one of your values is diversity and inclusion, for example, the decisions around some of these issues should be fairly simple. We had as a speaker at our conference recently, PayPal, which was a company that got out of North Carolina at some expense very quickly after the North Carolina passed a bathroom ban affecting transgender people. And, they were quite comfortable with that decision. It was something that everybody at the company agreed was the right thing to do. And I think it reinforced the idea that, those values are real. I don't think that's a downside at all.
So let me ask, you can no longer please everyone then, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And if so, how do you plan accordingly?
So look, I think that there are sort of two views about public relations and what public relations should be about. And I don't necessarily want to present this as a sort of blunt choice between one or the other. There's probably a continuum, right? But I think a lot of people in our business think that public relations is a popularity contest, that public relations is about trying to make everybody like you all the time. And the more people you can get to like you, um, or maybe, as a corollary to that, the fewer people you can get to dislike you, the better you're doing your job. Um, I think there's another view of our business that says that the real role of public relations and the way you build relationships is by knowing what you stand for and then acting as if you really do stand for it, understanding the values that underpin your business, and then living those values. And that will inevitably deepen and strengthen your relationship with people who share those values. And yes, it may end up alienating people who don't share those values. But all that means is that you have to know, you have to be sure that your values align with those of your employees and your consumers and other stakeholders. And I think, I don't want to just keep using the word values over and over again like a hammer that I'm hitting a nail with. But I really do think a lot of this comes down to what are our values? What do we believe as an organization? What's the right thing for us to do? And then doing that. And yes, it's incumbent upon you to think about those things before you're thrust into the political arena. But I don't actually think the process is that tricky.
Right. So let's say you have a politically active CEO or politically active executives at the company. What can the communications team do to prepare for that?
I think a lot of it comes down to sort of talking about these issues in the right way. So, I think I suspect based on the fact that I've been writing about this fairly intensively for the last couple of years, most people will have a sense of what my own political views are and where I stand on the current administration. Spoiler alert, not a fan. Um, and look, I think at the same time, sort of personal political attacks and framing this as criticism of a particular politician or a particular party is not helpful. But talking about it in terms of general principles and what the company believes, I think is fine. And so you have people like Mark Benioff at Salesforce talking about the homeless problem in California in a way that, and San Francisco in particular, in a way that makes it clear that he thinks San Francisco's largest corporate citizens should be part of the solution. You have Tim Cook talking about Apple's values around diversity and inclusion, and making it clear that they are driving the company's stand on issues ranging from LGBTQ all the way through to immigration. I think just helping them frame the message in a way that makes it about values and inclusion rather than about personal or party politics is something that corporate communicators can help with.
So, by the way, people are submitting questions. I'll just continue along and read those questions to Paul and answer them. So what if there is a difference in terms of what a company's business goals are versus what the internal stakeholders want or their views? How should a company thread that needle?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. First of all, if your values are totally misaligned with those of your stakeholders internally or externally, it probably requires an adjustment one way or the other. I've always suggested that the role of public relations people works two ways. It's either persuading external stakeholders to your, or external and internal stakeholders to your point of view, or it's persuading management that they need to change their point of view. But I think that one way or the other, you need to obviously understand what it is your stakeholders care about, where they stand on issues, and then try to be as aligned as you can within the confines of conscience. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Chick-fil-A and the positions they take, but I think that they really understand what it is that their consumers want them to do, and they've done a great job of doing that. And I think again, there are a lot of people out there who appreciate a principled position, even if they disagree with it. And there are politicians who come from a place of genuine conviction, and then there are politicians who come from a place of cynicism. And it's much easier, I think, to appreciate those who have a genuine conviction. So again, understand where your stakeholders sit on any particular political spectrum. But at the same time, don't be afraid to take a position that is, based on genuine principle.
Right. I feel like if people explain their position and how they came to it, I feel many consumers will view that they've been heard or respected, and that helps a company in those situations.
And by the way, I think it's very easy to overreact to what is actually a very loud but not very sort of significant number of people, particularly given the rise of digital and social media. So the first couple of days after Nike announced its new ad campaign, the news cycle was dominated by sort of online images of people burning their Nike sneakers and sort of generally objecting to the company taking a position. But within a week, the stock price was soaring. It was clear that the move had paid off in marketing terms. It was very true to the Nike brand, which has always been about defiance and challenging and standing up for your rights and individualism and all the things that were being celebrated there. And I think having the courage to stick with a position under fire while you figure out just sort of how it's going to play out, not necessarily in the first 24 hours, but after a week or two, is critically important too. And again, the CCO needs to understand sort of how issues like that evolve and the way in which the initial reaction is not necessarily the ultimate reaction, and be a calming influence inside the company, because I'm sure at Nike there were people who were freaking out on day one about whether that was going to backfire, and who 7 days later were feeling much calmer about it. That sort of wisdom and experience is something that good CCOs bring into the boardroom or the C-suite to make sure that a company has the courage of its convictions.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. And sometimes in the blogosphere or in social media, really the people who are penning something are really just talking to themselves and a small group, and you really want to wait to see if something has legs before you react to it.
Yeah.
It depends on the source, depends on the issue, depends on the company, of course, but a lot of times they're just talking to themselves. How do you compare, in terms of the preparation, how do you compare and think about a political crisis versus other kinds of crises? How should companies be thinking about the differences?
I think you have to be aware that in the political realm, there are individuals out there who are willing and able to drive the agenda in ways that perhaps you can't. And we've seen a number of examples of the current administration singling out companies, being critical of individual companies for either political positions or social positions, and you have to be prepared to weather that storm. And again, in a way, this is just like dealing with consumer activists. You do have to follow, as a company, I think, that that famous Michelle Obama line about when they go high, when they go low, we go high, right? I don't think you can sort of get down in the mud and scrap with politicians without tarnishing your reputation, which is why, again, I come back to this issue of values. You put everything in the framework of what it is that your organization believes in. But other than that, I think there's an understanding that and an expectation that companies will get involved in big social issues. But we're living in a world where the largest corporations in the world, the Amazons and the Googles and so on, are bigger than the vast majority of nation states. They have more economic and social influence than the governments of most countries. For them not to be involved in these issues would be much more surprising, I think, than what we're seeing right now, which is the expectation that they will do something, whether it's furthering the rights of the homeless in San Francisco or LGBTQ rights in North Carolina, whether it's immigration and other issues in which they actually have an economic stake. I think we've reached a point where it should no longer come as a surprise to anybody that they are expected to take a position, and not just sort of pay lip service to a position, but take action.
That's great. Again, I'm just going to read questions as they come in. So what about B2B companies? So they don't feel as much pressure from consumers. Should they take a more values-based approach? And if so, how and why?
Well, so I am first and foremost a proponent of this idea that values matter and that all companies should have them. It's not just about consumers; it's also about employees, and so I'm not sure that I think the rules are entirely different from a B2B company. I also think, frankly, that more and more consumer activists and other campaigns are looking at not just what an individual business does, but looking at supply chain issues. And if you're part of the supply chain, you have to be ready for your behavior to become a problem for the companies that you're supplying. So there are always going to be issues like that. Do I think the rules are different? I mean, I think it's probably easier to lie low as a B2B company, but I'm not. But I'm not sure it's wise, because I think sooner or later um, the spotlight shows up everywhere. We're living in an incredibly transparent age, right? We're living in an age where you should, I think, just in general, conduct yourself as if everything you say and everything you do, maybe even everything you think, is sooner or later going to end up on the front page of, if not the New York Times or CNN, um, a business news program, or a trade magazine. Um, and so, not to have thought these issues through, I think is fairly negligent, regardless of which sector you're in.
Sure. Another question that came in is in the nonprofit sector. So we've seen this with our nonprofit clients, where they are less comfortable taking political positions because it may affect their funding, it may affect their tax status, it may affect their fundraising abilities. So, but if it's clearly consistent with the organization's mission, how do communications and other executives, nonprofits, get board members and others comfortable?
Right. So again, I would say that it sort of depends on a couple of things, beyond what we've already talked about. The first is how close your particular cause is to the political debate. Um, if you're a champion of immigrants' rights, for example, I don't really see how you can avoid wading into the political arena, um, and in a quite partisan way right now. I mean, I think again you bring it down to values and mission and purpose. Um, but I think if you're involved in an issue that is polarized politically already, acknowledging that reality is not a bad thing to do. It's pretty much inevitable for companies who are for nonprofits rather, who are either less singular in their focus, or have a lower appetite for risk. Then I think it just comes down to deciding what your appetite for risk is. I mean, the advantages to wading into a political issue are that it raises your visibility, it brings you to the attention of people who might not otherwise be donors. And we've seen in some of the crowdfunding campaigns that have sprung up, not necessarily for nonprofits, but for some of the individuals involved in political issues. Whether you're somebody in sort of the Midwest who doesn't want to bake cakes for gay weddings, or whether you're somebody who accuses a nominee for the Supreme Court of sort of inappropriate sexual behavior. Personal crowdfunding generally reaches into 6 and 7 figures for those people. And so it's clear that there are a number of donors out there who are prepared to give money to people who take political positions that they agree with. Again, to a certain extent, this is going to depend on sort of the mission of your charity, the profile of your donor base, and your appetite for risk.
So I want to tread on that last point. Actually, we got a question that sort of treads on that as well. But so, in the current environment, how do companies, organizations find new audiences, reach new audiences, and also change perhaps what are common perceptions or misperceptions of what they do?
Wow, that's a big question. So
we'll do a separate webinar on that, but your top thoughts.
Yeah. In terms of the topic that we're talking about, I actually think there's a really interesting role for corporations in particular to play. because I think that they can make a principled case without it becoming sort of political. Um, Obviously, we're in a hyper partisan era where a lot of groups are talking past each other or yelling at each other, but very few minds are getting changed. I actually think corporations are in a useful space in that they're not generally dogmatic about this stuff. They're generally pragmatic about this stuff. They're generally, they generally have fairly reasoned positions, and I think making those positions clear, um, in a way that isn't, again, sort of personally or party political, um, gives them an opportunity to talk about these things in a third way, right? Not from left or right, but from a position of pragmatism. And I think that's incredibly useful, and it gives them permission to connect with people who disagree with them, perhaps in ways that hyperpartisan hacks on either side can't. Obviously, again, depending on sort of your appetite for this kind of thing, um, using all of the channels available to you is smart, and engaging with people in social media is smart, um, and you know, sort of mainstream media, traditional press relations is extremely useful. Even paid advertising can be helpful just to explain the company's position. I use all the channels that are available to you, I guess.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that one was a pretty large question. This will be our last question that we have time for. What are some pitfalls that companies can make in these situations? What is taking it too far in this situation?
I think anything that makes it look like you're taking it personally, anything that makes it look. So I should draw a distinction here, right? So I think Tim Cook talking about his personal experience in the context of LGBTQ issues is fine. I think making something sort of personal um, and getting angry about it is profoundly unhelpful. And so there's a question of tone and a question of um, a question of also buy-in from the rest of the senior leadership team that's very important. It's been very interesting, for example, to watch the debate at Google over the last year or so about whether the culture there is um, sort of actively unfriendly to people who are not liberal in their politics. And obviously, there's a very fine sort of balancing act to be handled there. You don't want if you're creating an atmosphere of inclusion and diversity, and you're talking about tolerance as one of your key principles, um, then to create an atmosphere that actually is politically or socially quite homogenous, that doesn't include diversity of opinion, is a little contradictory. And you need to therefore make sure, I think, that while you're taking these positions, you're not doing so in a way that demonizes people who don't necessarily agree with you. That is that encourages, to a certain extent, dissent and debate, rather than sort of making people feel uncomfortable in the workplace because they don't share your views. Um, and that can obviously be a fairly fine line to tread, and it's going to vary from organization to organization. But you know, one of the things that public relations people, I think, do really well is making sure that management is aware of opposing and dissenting viewpoints inside and outside the company. And we do this all the time, listening to activists and bringing their point of view into the C-suite and explaining to companies, you know, why people may disagree with their positions or their policies and even their products. So, you know, I think that the key qualities that make a great public relations person are the qualities that are most needed in this environment. And I've talked about this before, but you know, I think that there are four things that every great communicator needs. Curiosity, the desire to keep learning about both issues and people. Courage, the ability to sort of advocate for unpopular positions inside and outside the company. Empathy, the ability to understand how other people feel and why they feel that way. And integrity, you know, making sure that you are honest and intellectually honest in all of your positions. And if you bring all of those four qualities to the table, whether it's an ordinary crisis, a political crisis, or just day-to-day reputation management, then you'll be fulfilling a very important role and deserve the seat at the table that we've all talked about.
That's a great note to end on. So, Paul, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everybody, for participating and for your questions. And we appreciate everyone's time and thoughtfulness.
Yeah, that sort of flew by. I didn't realize we'd run out of time already.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thanks.